Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here tonight and for braving the rain to come out. We really appreciate it. I also want to thank Haverford High School for hosting us and for being so welcoming as we prepare for this event. My name is Marcia Holt, and I'm the Executive Director with Because Organization. We're really glad to have you here with us for this year's National Crime Victims' Rights Week speaker event. Tonight is really about creating space to learn, to listen, and to better understand what people experience and how we as a community respond. National Crime Victims' Rights Week is about three simple but important things. It's about awareness, making sure people understand that victims exist in every community, often in ways we don't see. It's about recognizing strength, the resilience it takes for individuals to move forward after harm. And it's about advocacy, because support doesn't happen by accident. It happens when people choose to show up and push for change. This week matters because awareness leads to action. When people understand what victims go through, they respond differently. They listen differently, and they support differently. And over time, that's what creates real change, not just individuals, but across systems and communities. At Because Organization, we're a survivor-centered nonprofit focused on anti-human trafficking work. Everything we do is grounded in one idea: meeting people where they are and supporting them with trauma-informed care, consistency, and respect. We focus specifically on human trafficking and exploitation. Globally, an estimated 26.7 million people are affected by human trafficking, according to the International Labor Organization. And while that number can feel distant, this issue is very much local. Delaware County is considered a higher risk area in part because of its location among major transit corridors, which can increase vulnerability and movement tied to exploitation. So this isn't something happening somewhere else. It's something that intersects with our own communities, often in ways we don't immediately see. What does Because Organization do? Our work centers around three main areas. We provide support and resources to individuals on their healing journey. We focus on education and awareness, helping communities recognize the signs of exploitation and understand how to respond. And lastly, we advocate for better systems and long-term solutions that actually protect and support people. We serve individuals who have experienced trafficking or exploitation. We also work with people who may be at risk, helping intervene earlier where possible. And just as importantly, we work with communities because awareness at the community level is what allows all of this to function. And that's really why we're here tonight. Not just to listen, but to better understand how all these pieces connect. We're going to hear from professionals who see different parts of this victim-centered work every day, from immediate crisis response and long-term trauma, to working with youth, to looking at how systems themselves impact outcomes. Our hope is that by the end of tonight, you walk away not just with more information, but with a clearer sense of how you can be part of the response. Our first speaker is Kimberly Hollenback, Legal Director for Crime Victims Law Project with Delaware County's Victim Assistance Center. Kimberly works closely with individuals and families in the immediate aftermath of crime, providing advocacy, guidance, and support during some of the most difficult moments in their lives. She brings both professional expertise and a deep commitment to meeting people with compassion and care. Please join me in welcoming Kimberly Hollenback.
I work for the Delaware County Victim Assistance Center. Previously, you might know, a few years ago, we were known as Women Against Rape or WAR, and I am the legal director of our Crime Victims Law Project. Next slide, please. All right, so yes, it's National Crime Victims' Rights Week, but April is also Sexual Assault Awareness Month. So that's why we wear the teal ribbons. The color is teal. And little statistic, 1 in 5 women and 1 in 33 men have been the victims of an attempted rape or a rape. That comes from the CDC. And what we know about that statistic is it's actually a little skewed because people highly underreport being sexually assaulted or raped, especially men, because of the stigmas and social, things surrounding that. So if you are sitting there thinking you don't know somebody that has been raped or had an attempted rape, you're wrong. Unfortunately, it's so prevalent in our community. We all know somebody or ourselves have been a victim of this very serious crime. So we also want to bring awareness to sexual assault during April. Next slide. All right, so just to give a brief overview of what our services are. So we are a rape crisis center, first and foremost. So we have a 24-hour, 7 days a week hotline where we have people on call to answer hotline calls, which I'll talk a little bit about in a little bit. But other services we provide. We have victim advocates. They do things like accompany people, whether it's to court, to the police if they have to do an interview, for medical examinations. We also have counseling services. We have wonderful therapists that can provide therapy for victims. What I do is provide civil legal services, and we have a whole division that does education, so awareness in the community. They have a wonderful K-12 program in Delaware County. They have great relationships with all the local schools. They do projects all over Delaware County, whether it's for professional groups, technical schools, colleges, and then also we provide assistance for what's called victim compensation, which is just money that victims of serious crimes or crimes in general can qualify for under a federal statute and a state statute. What's important to note is that all of our services are confidential and they're also free. What we try to do is provide a holistic service, and I don't think I mentioned, but we serve victims of crime and also sexual assault. Even though sexual assault tends to be our focus, if a crime happened in Delaware County or if a crime victim lives in Delaware County, we can provide them with services. So again, free, confidential. We want to break down sort of those barriers to entry that people have to receive services. And again, we try to provide a holistic service. So from counseling to the legal process, we try to be with victims every step of the way. All right, another interesting thing about our organization is that all of our staff are trained as sexual assault counselors, even me as a lawyer. Everybody has to get certified, which is we do over 40 hours of training, and we have to do continuing training each year. And so that also gives us sort of the unique perspective on being able to serve people in crisis, which is what I've been asked to talk to everybody about today. All right, so crisis can kind of look a little bit differently, victim to victim. No survivor is the same, but we do notice sort of patterns of things that sort of repeat, and it's not just one area that crisis can sort of manifest itself in. These are kind of the 4 common areas that we see trauma and crisis responses. So physical, obviously one of the more obvious things to see. So we'll get survivors that sort of come to us and, maybe they are the obvious things. They're expressing, they feel nauseous, they seem tired, they might have a rapid heartbeat, high blood pressure, dizziness, sweating, chills. You might even see them sort of have like tremors and things like that. So that's one area that we see a lot of those crisis responses, somebody that's responding to a crime. There also might be emotional effects. Maybe they're feeling fear, anxiety, grief, helplessness, denial. Maybe they feel overwhelmed, embarrassed. Maybe they feel like they want to hurt themselves. But there is also, besides the physical effects, there's cognitive effects too. They might have trouble concentrating. They might have trouble communicating. Maybe they're losing time, losing focus, memory issues, flashbacks, nightmares. And then of course there's also behavioral things that sort of manifest in response to this crisis. Things like maybe you're going to increase your use of alcohol or drugs, changes in your activity level, withdrawing from your friends or family, changes in appetite, things like that. So our job is to help people recognize that all of those things that I mentioned are normal responses to an abnormal experience, right? They're a victim of a crime and that they've experienced something abnormal, and all of those responses are normal. And a lot of times they're to be expected when somebody goes through something so serious like this. And again, it manifests differently person to person. There's no right way or wrong way. And we see the whole gambit. And maybe they feel this way one way, and then the next day they have a different reaction. So again, crisis manifests in so many different ways. And then on top of all those internal factors, they also have to deal with these external factors too that are affecting them in this crisis. We have things like just cultural or societal norms, like things like rape culture, where rape has sort of been normalized in our society, where people are objectified, and we have victim blaming and things like that. We also have sort of the external pressures of the criminal justice system and the civil justice system. We have maybe uninformed friends or families that are reacting to this crime, what this person's going through as well. So not only do we have all these internal things happening to this person responding to this crisis, they're also being affected by these external factors as well. And we see all of these manifestations a lot with our clients. Next slide, please. All right, I just wanted to give just a few examples of what sort of a normal week might look to somebody that's manning our hotline. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but sort of the typical calls we might get is we might get a call from a hospital saying that a rape victim just came in and they're about to do a rape kit and they need us to be there to advocate for them and support them. Or maybe we get a phone call from a police officer and they have a victim in front of them who needs that extra support. Or they want that person to get a protective order and they want me as a lawyer to come in and help them. So I'm gonna focus on the last one a little bit. So a college student that calls us because they were sexually assaulted in their dorm last night by a friend. So, next slide. What do we do? What is our job as a rape crisis center? How do we address these really awful things that I was just telling you about? It's hard, and I like to say sort of responding to these things is more a practice than a theory. Is you do it good some days. Nobody does it perfectly, but all you can do is sort of put your tools and put them to good use. So first of all, somebody calls our hotline, what they're gonna get is somebody that's listening, an empathetic ear without judgment, first and foremost. They're also gonna be reminded multiple times that this is all confidential. Because again, that's a real barrier for people to seek help. Because of all of those things we talked about, right? Embarrassment, grief, all of those things, maybe the way that those external factors responded to them. So knowing that they can talk to us and we can't tell anybody makes people feel a lot more comfortable going through this crisis together. So let's talk about the college student. So the college student is calling us because they were sexually assaulted. Some common things that we might be hearing. No one will believe me. Everyone knows this person on campus. No one's going to be going to be my friend anymore if I report this. Or we've had sex before, it's not rape. Or I didn't fight him off, so it's not rape. So again, our job is to listen, right, and take these things in, validate that these feelings are normal, but also to invalidate these myths of sexual assault, right? And that's where proactive support comes in. So then it's our job to say, I believe you, we believe you, everybody at this agency is going to believe you, every step of the way, and we'll be with you for each step of the way, whatever you decide to. And in that way, sort of client agency becomes really important of sort of, this is the road that we can take, but it's your decision whether we take that road or not. And so then also our job is to educate. Again, not assuming that there's any right or wrong way to respond to something, but we want to make sure that our clients understand what things are available for them if they need it. Sometimes they just want to talk and they just want somebody to listen, and that's okay. But for our college student that was sexually assaulted in their dorm, We might tell them, educate them and say, you could still go to the hospital and you could get an examination done, and we'll go with you. We'll be with you. We'll tell them it can also be anonymous. You don't have to put your name onto the rape kit if you don't want to. We'll also tell them about what their legal options are. If they want to report it to the police, we can go with you. We'll be with you. We will leave you. Here's what your options are. You don't have to do any of these things, but these are your options, because if you don't know what they are, then you won't know how to move forward. So again, educating is not assuming that there's any right or wrong decision to move forward. And then making an action plan. So that's where we sort of let the client guide us while we're providing support as to sort of what options that they may have, pros and cons of each, let them talk through it. And then the action plan is sort of taking crisis one step at a time. We try to get them from one moment to the next moment. We're not going to throw everything at them. Somebody that's having, real trauma response to what happened, it might just be about like, how do I get to sleep tonight, right? And we'll worry about the rest later. So taking it step by step, creating an action plan is sometimes, again, it's just taking it one day at a time. Other times it might be, all right, my plan is to contact you this time. I'm going to refer you with your consent to our legal division, to our therapy division, and sort of going from there. Again, that holistic approach that we can do so many different things for these victims. And then if there really is a true crisis response, while we are sexual assault counselors and some of our staff are trained therapists, if we have to make outside referrals, then we will, right? If we do get, unfortunately, clients that express feelings of wanting to harm themselves or harm others, and in that case, we might have to make referrals to mental health services, to mobile crisis. But that's part of it too, is understanding that that might be a reaction that happens, and sort of knowing what referrals are if we have to go down that road. All right, thank you for listening. I wanted to provide two really important numbers. So the first number is our 24-hour, 7-day-a-week hotline. Again, it's manned by somebody from our agency at all times. We don't have any answering system any longer. It is just our staff answering it at all times with that specialized training. And then also my number is the Law Project and my email address. And just really briefly, our Law Project, what we do is civil legal services. So we do things like get protective orders, which are restraining orders for victims of crime. We do child custody, some divorce work, landlord-tenant. Basically, we can do pretty much anything if it's a civil legal service that is related to the victimization. So thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Next, we have Devon Ferguson, Assistant Professor and Social Work Program Director at Newman University. Devon has over a decade of experience as a social worker in Philadelphia, supporting children and families impacted by trauma, abuse, and neglect. She's deeply passionate about helping others understand how trauma shapes lives and how we can respond in a more informed and supportive ways. Please help me welcome Devon Ferguson.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me okay? Again, thank you to Marcia and the Because organization for inviting me to share some hopefully helpful key takeaways about trauma in general. So first off, what is trauma, right? It's a word that gets thrown around a lot, but the meaning of what really is trauma is not always clear. And so we want to keep in mind that trauma is caused by an event or a series of events that basically overwhelms someone's ability to cope. And so, right, what that tends to feel like for someone who's experiencing an event as traumatic is, right, fear, of course, helplessness, dissociation, right, where they feel disconnected from what's actually happening to them, that sort of feeling, maybe even kind of like, floating over the scene of what's happening. And confusion, right? What is happening? How did I find myself here? And so right? Of course, traumatic experiences feel, right, they are harmful, they can be life-threatening, and really they tend to shape someone's sort of trust in the world being safe, right, or other people being safe, and therefore, right, it's this feeling of sort of how do I go on, right, knowing that something so horrible, dangerous, terrifying, right, has happened. And so the sort of hallmark of an experience being traumatic is that there tends to be long-lasting negative impact on the survivors, attitudes, behavior, and sort of overall functioning. And Kim really sort of touched on some of that, right? The behavior, there's a social component, emotional component, which I'll talk a little bit more about. Right, and so it's really important not to make assumptions when working with or supporting people who have experienced trauma. So first off, sure, there are certain events, certain situations that, you know, pretty likely are going to be experienced as traumatic, but the event itself is not necessarily traumatic, right? It's the person or the community's reaction, right, or experience of the event. And so we want to be careful that we aren't assuming that, you know, two people who are both in a car accident or watching a car accident are going to respond, right, or experience that in the same way. One person might walk away from a car accident feeling, right, traumatized. The other person might not. There's a lot of reasons why someone might experience an event as traumatic, whereas then somebody else wouldn't. And so we want to make sure, though, that we're also keeping in mind, you know, so, right, the trauma is sort of external to the individual, and it's not a result of someone having a deficit in some way. So the idea of resilience, right, we all sort of contain, you know, are innately resilient. Multiple traumatic or even, you know, sort of adverse or difficult experiences can sort of chip away, right, at someone's resilience, make them more likely to experience an event as traumatic. Again, that doesn't mean that there's something wrong with the person. It might mean that they haven't had consistent support, right, an opportunity to process difficult or traumatic experiences through therapy or something like that. So again, we want to keep in mind that, you know, not everyone is going to experience a similar event in exactly the same way. And so, not quite yet, sorry. And so another thing, right, especially as I worked for a large part of my career with even very, very young children, right, we do know, unfortunately, that someone can experience trauma even if they don't remember the event. It's the next slide, thank you. Right, and so we do know that, especially for young children, if they experience a trauma, it could be incredible amounts of stress in the house, maybe related to, you know, domestic violence. They can exhibit or right, sort of be marked by that experience in a traumatic way, even though they wouldn't have any recollection. And so it's important, right, as we try to understand how trauma impacts people and especially can cause long-term effects, right? These two brain scans, if you Google trauma, brain, you know, impact, probably these will come up, right? And so all the way to my right is the brain of a typically developing child, right? So you can see that there's, you know, a lot of color, right? There's not too many areas that are like, you know, dark, kind of like a black or dark purple color. You can even see that the overall brain, right, is a little bit larger than the brain closer here on my right, which is a brain scan of a child who's been exposed to neglect and trauma and abuse, right? And so we see that literally traumatic experiences rewire individuals' brains, particularly in young childhood, childhood when kids' brains are the most sponge-like. And so, this is not irreversible, right? I definitely don't want to give the impression that there's no hope, for children or for anyone who has experienced traumatic events. But we do know that if trauma is not treated, it can have these long-lasting impacts. Again, Kim touched on some of them, right? For young kids, we might see sort of behavioral issues, right? Aggression. We might see some developmental delays. We might see kids as they get older, having trouble with focus, with attention. From my years of working in child welfare, it was pretty common to see children who we knew came out from, sort of abusive situations. We maybe didn't know all the details, get diagnosed with ADHD first, right? So again, some of those cognitive, memory, attention, executive functioning, aspects of brain development get impacted by traumatic events, and again, can sort of mirror the symptoms sometimes of other learning, difficulties or challenges. Next slide. Right, and so, certainly if you want kind of a primer on how early experiences of adversity or trauma can make a lasting impact, the ACEs study is a great place to start. And really what we've learned from this study is that difficult experiences in childhood, again, if left untreated, can have long-lasting into adulthood effects. And some of these, right, might seem pretty obvious. Up there is, higher rates of things like depression, anxiety, suicide, PTSD in, later on in life and adulthood. But some of these other, not so great outcomes, right, really show sort of this mind-body connection that we know that connection exists, right, and how that can sort of all be kind of thrown off potentially by unprocessed traumatic experiences. So everything from, a higher likelihood of unintended pregnancy or pregnancy complications, HIV, STDs, things that you wouldn't necessarily think would be related to trauma, but when you think about it as extreme stress on the body, right, it makes more sense. So things like cancer, diabetes, high blood pressure, and then of course some more mental health related sort of behaviors like alcohol and drug abuse. And then, right, as a social worker who's also thinking about, sort of social justice and equity, we know that for people who have experienced adverse childhood situations, they, are at higher risk later on in life for poorer educational outcomes, occupational outcomes, or lower levels of income. So again, not to paint this doomsday sort of picture, but we know that trauma needs to be taken seriously when it happens at any point in a person's life. But again, even when it happens to young children, if there's not that support there, again, through therapy, family support, there can be, detrimental long-term consequences. Right? And so how do you recognize trauma? I always tell my students, once you kind of know what trauma looks like, it's like you kind of see it everywhere, right? Because unfortunately we do know that it's really common for people to have experienced at least one traumatic experience throughout their life. And so, when you think about trauma sort of shaking someone's, again, belief in safety, their ability to trust others, you might see what's listed to your left, right? These are kind of the day-to-day behaviors or presentations that you might kind of see popping up, whether you're, if you're a teacher, right, if you're working, you know, again, in legal services, whatever sort of role you're in professionally or otherwise, right, you might see some of these sort of challenging presentations. It comes back to our automatic survival response, right? Most people are familiar with fight or flight, right? It's more common now also to think about fight, flight, or freeze. And research around trauma has also more recently demonstrated a fourth sort of automatic response, which is bomb, right? So fight, probably pretty obvious. Someone who kind of gets their back up really easily, might kind of seems maybe hyper vigilant or sort of always on edge, right? Has a lot of trouble trusting others, right? Might have difficulty managing their emotions. So again, maybe kind of gets agitated, angry when it doesn't really seem warranted by the situation. Flight, somebody who just, right, they're gonna avoid conflict. That can look like a really difficult time making decisions. Again, especially we know when if executive functioning has been impacted by a traumatic experience. So just, right, feeling really overwhelmed by making even what, you know, we might consider to be sort of simple or basic everyday decisions, right? Someone with a trauma response, like, just can't do it, doesn't want to do it. The freeze, again, they just sort of inactive. They're not kind of, you're like, what's going on? They might seem, they might seem sort of like disconnected or zoned out. So again, if you're in whatever work environment you're in, you might see colleagues, you might see students, right, who might be presenting this way. And then the fawn piece can look like someone who, you know, as now that I'm an educator, I sort of think about the students who appear to be kind of like the teacher's pet, like they always have a question, they always want my attention, they always want to check in, am I doing this right, you know, and so it's, you know, it's not necessarily like negative in a way, right, but it's this over need to sort of please and connect, right? And so again, those are sort of our body's automatic responses to scary, traumatic experiences, and again, a little bit of information about how that might show up for people in their day-to-day lives. Next slide. And so, right, how can we respond to trauma? And so these are generally considered like trauma-informed practice, you know, mechanisms, right? So trying to establish safety, of course, physical safety, but again, wherever you work, or if you're a coach, you know, how can you make people feel also emotionally safe to be themselves, right? How inclusive is a workspace, or you know, how inclusive is a team, right? Do people feel like they can show up and be themselves? They're going to be respected. Their boundaries are going to be respected, right? So it's not just that physical safety, but it's the emotional and sort of social safety as well. Again, when someone's sort of trust in the world has been seriously shook, a way to combat that, right, is to be trustworthy, to be transparent. So again, regardless of your role, do you do what you say you're going to do? If someone asks a question or needs help and that's out of your wheelhouse, do you say, I don't know, but I'm going to find out, and then you actually, right, get back to them with the information? So you don't have to be, you know, an expert on trauma necessarily, but again, just being as transparent, consistent, patient, right, and allowing for that trust to be built is really important. You know, wherever you can help link people who have experienced trauma with other survivors, right, because there is that feeling of isolation, that feeling of shame that often accompanies experiencing a traumatic event, or certainly a series of traumatic events, right? What did I do wrong? You know, I should have stopped it. And so again, that peer support piece can be very normalizing and validating. and working with survivors. This kind of goes along with, trustworthiness and some of these others, and also empowerment, right? So collaboration. We want to, experiences of trauma are disempowering, right? Something has happened to someone that they did not want to have happen, they couldn't stop it, right? And so wherever we can build bridges, respect people's wisdom, their lived experiences, right? Work together, and then, right, also offer empowerment, offer choice, right? Sometimes as helpers, I think we can run the risk of, oh, right, I care so much, I want to help, like, let me tell you what to do, or, I know what you should do next. And even though that comes from a good place, that can actually be disempowering, right? It can be overwhelming. And so we really want to think about how we can collaborate and empower survivors so that they can take ownership back over, their lives in general, but also related to the experience that has been traumatic. And you really want to keep in mind sort of the cultural and historical context. Again, Kim mentioned rape culture, but also we know that experience of racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, right? Those types of cultural, social, sort of systems issues can also be traumatic. For individuals, but also groups who identify with those, right? Individuals who identify with groups who are experiencing, discrimination, marginalization, things like that. And so, a really important thing to keep in mind in responding to trauma, right, really has to do with this idea of reframing. So, again, whether whoever you're working with, they're coming across maybe even as kind of angry, hostile, or disengaged, can't make a decision, whatever it might look like, rather than asking yourself, and we all do this, especially when we feel, overwhelmed ourselves, but rather than asking, oh, what is wrong with, so-and-so, the trauma-informed, approach would say to ask instead, I wonder what might have happened, right, to so-and-so. And when you reframe it, right, it's you're open, right, you're feeling more kind, more compassionate, right, wanting again to work and support someone who's experienced trauma. And so that is just, it might seem like a small kind of switch, but really, really important. And so I just want to follow, Dr. Perry is certainly considered an expert on trauma, and I've mentioned a bunch. We don't want to think about, okay, someone's experienced this really horrific situation or multiple experiences of trauma. Oh my gosh, like how are they ever going to get over it, right? We know that relationships, right, social support, consistent, nurturing, trusting relationships, that's maybe not the only thing that will help someone on their journey of recovery, but it is absolutely essential to any trauma survivor's journey of recovery. And so again, whether it's a friend, someone through a professional role, consistently demonstrating those trauma-informed practices and building that really positive, consistent relationship goes a really, really long way towards supporting someone through their process of recovery. So, thank you.
Our next speaker is Amanda Taylor from the Be Proud Foundation. Amanda works directly with youth who are navigating adversity and difficult life circumstances by providing mentorship, advocacy, and consistent support. She is passionate about helping young people build confidence, find their voice, and move towards a more positive path. Let's give a warm welcome to Amanda Taylor.
My name is Amanda Taylor, and I'm the director of the Be Proud Foundation. Be Proud is a nonprofit organization located in Media. We have a client accountability program, which we work with youth aged 11 through 21 who are referred to us through either Delaware County Juvenile Probation or Children and Youth Services. We provide mentorship and case management services through our community-based program, which helps connect youth with additional services and eliminates barriers to completing the requirements of their supervision. Typically, our program eliminates barriers. Typically, our program receives referrals for youth with multiple barriers in their lives. Before we try to peel back the layers of trauma and experiences these youth come to us with, we try to meet them where they're at, as well as meet their basic needs, which are often not met. Our executive director has always grounded our work in the principles of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, prioritizing the fundamental necessities of food, shelter, and clothing as the foundation for any meaningful progress. Our program is often described by what we do, but in reality, what we encounter far more often are situations that are filled with uncertainty. Cases that come to us labeled as, we're not quite sure what's going on. Every other person we work with has a unique story, which despite their age is not linear. A consistent pattern emerges. Roughly 9 out of every 10 have experienced victimization at some point in their lives, whether it's in the past or ongoing. Their stories are filled with ups and downs and roadblocks. Often these ups and downs demonstrate that long before they became offenders, they found themselves as victims. Sometimes it takes months to uncover these experiences, other times only days. But time and time again, we learn that many of the youth we serve have endured significant trauma. For some, the trauma has been present since the beginning of their lives. For others, it's developed gradually through an accumulation of adverse experiences over time. Regardless of how it begins, the impact is profound and is often what leads them to the situation in which it caused for them to come in contact with the law. I could probably speak for hours about the trauma and barriers many of our clients have faced. However, there is one specific story that is one that will stay with me forever, but will also really illustrate how often youth offenders are also victims themselves. A few years ago, I received a call from the probation department about a 14-year-old female who had already worked with multiple programs and was discharged unsuccessfully from each one. She'd eloped from her home for extended periods of time without much other information other than the uncertain statement that the probation officer said, "We really don't know what's going on with her." One of the most lasting comments from that conversation I had with the referring probation supervisor was something along the lines of, "This case is a mess. You can tell me if you can't take it. I mean, I wouldn't take it if I were you," which immediately made me say yes. I went on to work with this youth for close to 2 years. About 6 months into working with her, mostly seeing her at school because of her frequent elopement, she became more open with me. Each time I saw her, she shared more about her life with me, which often included trips to Philadelphia, often staying overnight with people that she had just met, and not returning to Delaware County for days or weeks. While talking, we eventually got to the root of her elopement. Her mother had made it clear that she was no longer welcome in their home. As a result, the youth was forced to fend for herself and secure her own housing. I would continue to work with her for about the next year, seeing her very seldom as she eloped from the home for longer and longer periods of time. When I saw her, she would immediately open up and tell me what she had been doing, which almost always involved different variations of her in situations with female peers and adults. She went on to disclose to me that she was sexually involved with men that she was coming in contact with. She was always willing to talk to me, sharing some details, but was definitely guarded about most. In all her conversations with me, she was always justified what was happening by saying that at least she had a place to stay, even if it was only for a few nights at a time. She continued to report situations like this over the course of a year. Each time, these situations contained elements that suggested exploitation, consequently leading me to make multiple child lines frequently. Eventually, local law enforcement conducted an investigation, which led to the FBI's involvement. The FBI then set up an undercover operation in which they had been communicating with someone on the dark web who was arranging to send a female adolescent to a motel to perform sexual acts and engage in exchange for money. Local law enforcement reached out to me, as well as my client's family support line advocate and her social service advocate, to ask if we would like to be nearby when this undercover operation occurred, because they believed our client would be the female child sent to the motel. There was no doubt in my mind. I immediately responded yes. I will never forget the anticipation in leading up to those hours of this operation. I equally wanted my client to show as I did not want her to show. I so desperately did not want this to be a reality for her. However, if it was, I knew it would be the beginning of justice for her, and more importantly, a way for her to safety. The unthinkable came to fruition, and my client was the one sent to the motel. Her other advocates and I were able to see her shortly after law enforcement came in contact with her. She was clearly as confused and rattled as she was relieved. In the next several weeks, the investigation continued. The adults responsible for the operation she was involved in were apprehended. In addition, about 10 other female children were recovered from this operation. Both of these things were largely possible because my client worked with the FBI and disclosed pertinent information. Over the next year, this case would be tried before a federal grand jury, at which my client would testify, ultimately leading to adults involved being prosecuted. What connects all these young people is a fundamental need to be heard and to be met with empathy. We strive to be mentors for our clients, lending them unconditional compassion and emotional support. While that support can come from many sources, the role of certain individuals is especially crucial. Those who first interact with youth, like educators, first responders, medical and social service professionals, serve as the front line. Their ability to approach each situation with an open mind and a willingness to ask why can make a lasting difference. Mentoring provides the youth we work with a positive, consistent relationship that helps build the foundation for pro-social and law-abiding behavior. It's essential that young people that come in contact with the legal system are not defined solely by their actions, but are understood within the context of their experiences. Over the past decade, Delaware County has had a fluctuation in the availability of resources for youth involved in legal and child welfare systems. Despite the challenges, we are fortunate to have strong community partners, including organizations such as Family Support Line, Chester Community Coalition, Making a Change Group, Delco Behavioral Health, Delco Rising, Chester Education Foundation, and citywide counseling, just to name a few, who continue to provide critical support and advocacy. At the end of the day, many of the young people who come to us labeled as offenders are, in truth, children who have been hurt, often repeatedly and deeply. If we fail to recognize that, we risk responding only to their behavior and not seeing the pain behind it. But when we choose to see them fully, both what they've done and what's been done to them, we create the opportunity not just for accountability, but for healing and real change.
Finally, we'll hear from Zane Memeger of the PA Innocent Project. Zane brings extensive legal experience, including serving as the former U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. His work now focuses on addressing wrongful convictions and advancing a more fair and accountable justice system with a deep commitment to ensuring that justice is both accurate and equitable. Please join me in welcoming Zane Memeger.
Good evening. Thanks, Marcia, for the introduction. It's really an honor to be here for National Crime Victims' Rights Week. I'm Zane Memeger. I'm the Executive Director for the Pennsylvania Innocence Project, and we represent individuals who are actually innocent of the crimes that they were convicted of, and get them released from prison and then help them restore their lives through our reentry services. I pivoted to this role from a career in law enforcement. I was a line prosecutor with the United States Attorney's Office for 11 years, where I did organized crime and public corruption cases. And then I was the United States Attorney here in southeastern Pennsylvania from 2010 to 2016. But the guiding principle for me is you want to make sure that the criminal justice system has gotten it right, and that people are being held accountable for things that they did. Next slide. As I said, our goal at the Pennsylvania Innocence Project is to exonerate people who are wrongfully convicted and then help them get back into the community. We only represent individuals who are actually innocent of the crime that they committed, and we have an intense review process to make those determinations. Cases come into our office, we review them, we then move it into an investigation phase. If we believe that there's a case of actual innocence, we're not interested in cases where someone claims that they were sentenced to prison for too long, or cases where maybe their attorney wasn't as good as they hoped their attorney was. That's not our interest. We are looking for cases where the facts demonstrate that the person didn't do it. It can be situations where it's DNA evidence points to a different perpetrator. The evidence shows that an individual falsely confessed maybe to a crime that they didn't commit. In the criminal justice system, interrogations can be an intense affair at certain times. You have individuals who come in with a learning disability. You have individuals who are very young and all they want to do is get home. Law enforcement officers are allowed during the course of an interrogation to lie to individuals about what has transpired in order to try and get someone to admit. If you deprive someone of sleep, deprive people of food, it's unfortunate, but people sometimes, the mind causes them to admit to things that they didn't do, and in those circumstances, they may be prosecuted and convicted of a crime that they did not, in fact, commit. There are issues with regard to witness identifications and things of that nature as well. We represent individuals in serious crimes, and so I'm talking about murder, robbery, rape, sexual assault, aggravated assault, where individuals sentenced to significant periods of time in prison, 15, 20 years, 30 years, all the way up to life. And they're serving time for things that they did not do. And we try to assist them to get out. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, I've talked about the intake process and we secure releases, but some other things that we do is we provide client support. In Pennsylvania, individuals who are wrongfully convicted of crime come out of prison. There's no compensation for them, and there are no services provided to them. And our clients often have served 15, 20, 30 years in prison when they are released into the community again. And we have a social worker that works with 2 local schools, Drexel University and Westchester University, in order to provide reentry services, help individuals get their driver's licenses in order, help them get their medical benefits, help them get housing, help them get job training, help them get employment, get reintegrated back in the community from which they were taken over decades ago. Next slide. We can skip this one and go to the next one. With regard to the issue of wrongful convictions, it is a significant issue here in the United States. Since 1989, there have been 3,801 people who were exonerated here in the United States for crimes that they did not commit. In Pennsylvania, that number is 145 individuals. The Pennsylvania Innocence Project was founded in 2009. We're celebrating our 17th year anniversary. This year, we've helped 38 individuals today get exonerated and released from prison. So this is not an isolated issue in terms of wrongful conviction. And I, unfortunately, having served as a United States Attorney, where I had the luxury of being able to decide cases that the United States Attorney's Office would take, we would see cases come in from some of the local prosecutors' offices, particularly in Philadelphia, where there were issues with regard to how a case was investigated, that things in the file just did not seem to align with what actually happened. There were indicators that false testimony may be involved. There were indicators that certain benefits had been given to witnesses in order to get them to testify to certain things that hadn't happened. But we had the luxury of turning those cases away. But unfortunately, that happens more often, not more often, but more than you would like it to happen. And again, from my perspective, we want to make sure that the system has gotten it right. Next slide, please. There are a number of things that can contribute to wrongful convictions. I mentioned witness identifications, false confessions, official misconduct can occur in cases. There are situations where law enforcement has investigated a case, but they didn't do necessarily a thorough investigation. They just wanted to find someone and prosecute rather than look at the details as they were coming in. Sometimes there's evidence that clearly shows that it was another perpetrator, but they don't follow that lead. Sometimes there are individuals within a neighborhood that are just a problem in the past for law enforcement, and they become a target of law enforcement for purposes of prosecution, regardless of whether or not they in fact committed the crime or not. And so with that predisposition having already been made, the law enforcement may put a case together that is not as solid as it should be for purposes of prosecution. But unfortunately, because of the nature of the crimes that are sometimes involved, a conviction will occur, and then we have to, as the Innocence Project, unwind that conviction. Next slide, please. For us, it's really important for individuals who have been wrongfully convicted to have those services provided to them to come back into the community. And this is a slide of Bill Bailey coming home 2 years ago after being wrongfully convicted of a crime that he had not committed. For me, and this being National Crime Victims' Right, this is a hard issue for me to talk about at times because I was law enforcement for so long and always believing that I was doing the right thing and pursuing cases the right way. But unfortunately, I've learned over the course of time that law enforcement is not perfect, and it does at times get things wrong. Which brings me to the victims of crime, which in our cases, unfortunately, there's a re-victimization because oftentimes cases are prosecuted through appeal. Individuals who have been impacted have been provided information by law enforcement that the perpetrator has been caught and rightfully prosecuted. But sometimes, as I mentioned, that is not in fact the case. And then the victim has to relive this experience again, and knowing that perhaps the real perpetrator is out there and has committed additional crimes against other individuals because law enforcement didn't do its job. And so from my perspective, it's just really important for law enforcement to really focus in on their cases, their investigations, make sure that they're doing everything correctly to pursue cases involving serious crimes so that that re-victimization does not occur. Because when it does occur, you've got the actual victim of the crime, but then you also have the innocent person who's now served time for something that they didn't do. And that's not acceptable in a world where our criminal justice system should be fair and hold people accountable for the things that they do. So it's really an honor to be here this evening, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about the work of the Pennsylvania Innocence Project during this week of National Crime Victims' Rights Week. Thank you.